The morning I opened my mailbox to find a bill for $375 from the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I knew my Tuesday was about to go sideways. The invoice, printed on expensive-looking letterhead with raised gold lettering, claimed I owed money for snow removal services performed on my property during the February blizzard that had dumped 18 inches on our suburban Denver neighborhood. I stood there in my driveway, cold wind whipping against my face, reading the document 3 times to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The problem was simple and glaring. I had personally shoveled every inch of snow from my driveway, walkway, and the sidewalk in front of my house. I'd been out there at 5 in the morning with my snowblower, clearing everything before I left for work. My neighbors had watched me do it. Hell, I'd even helped old Mr. Patterson next door with his driveway because his back was acting up. The bill was signed by Patricia Morrison, the HOA president, a woman I'd had the distinct displeasure of dealing with since I bought my house on Clearwater Drive 8 months ago. Patricia was the textbook definition of what the internet had taught me to call a Karen. Mid-40s, asymmetrical blonde bob that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and an attitude that suggested she believed the entire neighborhood existed solely for her personal management. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the bill, then headed back inside my modest 3-bedroom ranch. My name is Warren Fletcher, and I'm a financial analyst for a commercial real estate investment firm downtown. Numbers are my life. Documentation is my religion. And right now, those instincts were telling me this wasn't just a simple billing error. After changing out of my work clothes, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and started pulling up files. I'm meticulous about documentation, especially when it comes to property maintenance. I had time-stamped photos from my phone showing my cleared driveway at 6:15 that morning after the blizzard. I had my weather app history showing I'd checked the forecast at 4:30 before getting up early. I even had a text message to my coworker saying I'd be in late because of snow removal. But as I dug deeper into my HOA files, something else caught my attention. 3 months ago, I'd received a notice about a special assessment for neighborhood improvements. It was a hefty sum, $5,000 per household, and the payment deadline had been aggressive, only 30 days. I'd paid mine immediately because that's how I operate, but I remembered thinking at the time that the timeline seemed designed to catch people off guard. My curiosity piqued. I logged into the county assessor's website. Property records in Colorado are public, and I'd learned how to navigate them well during my career. I started searching for liens in the Riverside Meadows subdivision. What I found made me sit back in my chair and let out a low whistle. 15 properties in our 70-home neighborhood had tax liens filed against them. Not for property taxes, which would be county liens, but for HOA dues and assessments. The amounts varied, but they all stemmed from that special assessment 3 months ago. And here's where it got interesting. Those liens had been sold to a third-party investor 2 weeks ago in a bulk sale. The investor was listed as Fletcher Holdings, LLC. Fletcher Holdings was my company. Well, technically it was my side business, but I was the sole owner and operator. I bought distressed debt as an investment strategy. Tax liens, HOA liens, small business debt. I'd purchased them through an intermediary at a foreclosure auction, a blind pool of local HOA debt that had looked like a solid investment on paper. I hadn't known the specific properties because that's not how bulk purchases work. You get a list of lien amounts, locations, and legal descriptions, but not always the street addresses until after closing. I just discovered that I now held the debt on 15 of my neighbors' homes, including several people I knew by name. And unless I was very much mistaken, one of those properties was about to become very relevant to my fake snow removal bill. I spent the next hour cross-referencing addresses. Property records showed Patricia Morrison lived at 2847 Clearwater Drive, just 4 houses down from mine. I pulled up my Lien portfolio spreadsheet and filtered by street name. There it was, 2847 Clearwater Drive. Patricia Morrison owed $12,300 to the HOA for the special assessment, plus late fees, interest, and administrative costs that had ballooned the total to nearly $16,000. And as of 2 weeks ago, I owned that debt. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. The woman billing me for services I never received was in default on a massive HOA debt that I now controlled. I sat back and considered my options. I could simply contest the snow removal bill, provide my documentation, and move on. That would be the mature, level-headed approach. Or I could do something more interesting. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my buddy Marcus from the gym. "Hey man, you see the neighborhood Facebook group today?" he asked without preamble. I didn't spend much time on social media, especially not the HOA group. "No, what's up?" Patricia Morrison is on a rampage. She's posted about 8 people who supposedly violated snow removal codes during the last storm. She's billing everyone $300 to $400 each. People are losing their minds. I pulled up the Riverside Meadows Facebook group on my laptop. Sure enough, the last 2 hours had been a firestorm. Patricia had made a long post about neighborhood standards and the importance of proper snow removal for safety and property values. She'd included photos of various driveways and sidewalks that she claimed hadn't been adequately cleared, though the photos were taken at odd angles that made it hard to tell what was actually going on. The comments section was brutal. Homeowners were furious, pointing out that they'd cleared their own snow. Several people noted that Patricia herself had hired a private service and seemed to be trying to force everyone else to do the same, possibly the same company she used. Someone named Jennifer posted that the company Patricia kept recommending was owned by her brother-in-law. Now things were getting clearer. This wasn't about snow removal standards. This was about Patricia trying to funnel business to a family member's company and using her HOA position to do it. The fake bills were probably just the opening salvo. If people didn't pay, she'd likely threaten fines or even liens. The irony that she herself was already drowning in HOA debt wasn't lost on me. I called the number on my fake bill the next morning. A woman answered on the second ring. Riverside Meadows HOA, this is Patricia Morrison speaking. "Hi Patricia, this is Warren Fletcher from 2891 Clearwater. I received a bill yesterday for snow removal services." "Yes, Mr. Fletcher." Her voice had that particular tone that suggested she was already preparing for conflict and relishing it. "Your property was not properly maintained during the February storm. The HOA contracted emergency services to ensure compliance with our covenants." "I cleared my own snow," I said calmly. "I have time-stamped photos and witness testimony. The HOA inspection determined your property was not in compliance at the time of service. The bill stands." "What time was this inspection?" "That's not relevant. The service was rendered and payment is due within 15 days. I let a moment of silence hang on the line. "Patricia, I'm looking at photos I took at 6:15 in the morning showing my completely cleared driveway and walkway." "What time did this inspection occur, Mr. Fletcher? I don't appreciate your confrontational tone." "The HOA board has authority to assess fees for covenant violations. If you wish to dispute this, you can request a hearing, but the bill remains due regardless. And if I don't pay, then late fees will apply, followed by potential lien placement on your property. She sounded almost pleased about this possibility. I see. Can you send me documentation of the service that was supposedly performed? Names of the contractors, time of service, photos of the work. That information is not typically provided. The bill is sufficient documentation. Actually, under Colorado HOA law, specifically the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, I'm entitled to detailed records of any services billed to my property. I'd like those records within 7 business days, as required by statute. The silence on her end lasted several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had tightened. I'll have to consult with our attorney. You do that. And Patricia, while you're talking to your attorney, you might want to ask about the legality of billing homeowners for services that were never performed, especially if those bills are designed to benefit a family member's business. Just a thought. I hung up before she could respond. My heart was pounding. I'm not naturally confrontational, but something about Patricia Morrison brought out a side of me I didn't usually access. Maybe it was the casual fraud. Maybe it was the abuse of authority. Or maybe it was just the sheer audacity of trying to scam someone who happened to own her debt. That afternoon, I got a call from a lawyer. He introduced himself as Richard Kensington, attorney for the Riverside Meadows HOA. Mr. Fletcher, I understand you're disputing a snow removal assessment. That's correct. I never received the service I'm being billed for. Mrs. Morrison has provided me with the details of the situation. The HOA has broad authority to maintain neighborhood standards. The assessment is valid. Then you'll have no problem providing documentation of the service, including contractor names, time of service, and photographic evidence of work performed. Kensington cleared his throat. The HOA is not required to provide such detailed documentation for minor assessments. Actually, you are. CCOA Section 3833.3217 requires HOAs to maintain detailed records of all assessments and make them available to homeowners upon request. I made that request yesterday. I expect compliance within the statutory time frame. Another pause. Mr. Fletcher, are you an attorney? No, I'm a financial analyst who specializes in real estate. I know the law because it's relevant to my work. I see. Well, I'll review the matter with my client. However, I should inform you that pursuing this dispute may result in additional legal fees being assessed to your account. And I should inform you that threatening homeowners with fees for exercising their legal rights could be considered harassment under Colorado law. It might also interest the state regulatory board that oversees HOA attorneys. The conversation ended shortly after that, though not before Kensington suggested we were getting off on the wrong foot and perhaps we could work something out. I told him I'd wait for the documentation I'd requested. 3 days later, I received a letter in the mail. Not from Kensington, but from Patricia Morrison directly. The letter stated that upon further review, there had been an administrative error regarding my snow removal assessment. The bill was being withdrawn, and I should disregard the previous invoice. There was no apology, no explanation, just a terse notification that the matter was closed. I should have been satisfied. I'd won. The fake bill was gone, but I checked the neighborhood Facebook group and saw that none of the other homeowners had received similar letters. Patricia was still insisting their bills were valid. Several people had already paid rather than fight. The ones who were fighting were being threatened with legal action. That's when I decided I wasn't going to let this go. I spent the next week doing research. Deep research. I pulled every HOA board meeting minute going back 3 years. They were public record, available to any homeowner, though buried on a rarely visited section of the neighborhood website. I reviewed the HOA's financial statements, which were also technically available to homeowners, though Patricia had a habit of making them difficult to access. What I found was a pattern of concerning behavior. The special assessment from 3 months ago hadn't been properly voted on. According to the HOA bylaws, any assessment over $1,000 required a vote of the full membership, not just the board. Patricia had rammed it through with just the 5-person board, all of whom she'd carefully selected over the years. The money from that assessment, nearly $350,000 from the homeowners who'd paid, had supposedly gone toward neighborhood improvements. New landscaping at the entrance, repairs to the community pool, updating the playground equipment. But when I looked at the actual invoices, something didn't add up. The landscaping company that received $90,000 was owned by Patricia's husband. The pool repair company that got $45,000 had the same registered address as Patricia's brother-in-law's snow removal business. The playground equipment company didn't exist at all. The business license led to a dead end. I was looking at what appeared to be systematic embezzlement, probably totaling well over $100,000. And the homeowners who'd questioned the assessment or couldn't pay it quickly enough had been hit with liens that wrecked their credit and put their homes at risk. I needed help with this. My expertise was in finance, not legal strategy. I called my friend David, who worked as a prosecutor in the Denver District Attorney's office. We'd gone to college together, and I trusted his judgment. "Warren, my man, what can I do for you?" David's voice was warm and energetic as always. "I need advice on something. Possibly something criminal, I'm not sure." That got his attention. I spent the next 45 minutes walking him through everything I'd discovered: Patricia's fake bills, the improper special assessment, the apparent embezzlement through fake vendors and family-owned businesses. The liens on homeowners who couldn't pay. David listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Okay, so first of all, this is civil HOA stuff, which isn't really my department. But the embezzlement angle, if you can prove it, that's criminal fraud. Potentially theft, forgery if any documents were falsified, and possibly racketeering if there's an ongoing scheme. What should I do? Document everything. I mean everything. Bank records, invoices, meeting minutes, witness statements from homeowners. Then you've got a few options. You could report it to the police directly, but HOA fraud cases are often low priority unless there's a ton of money involved. You could hire a lawyer and sue the HOA, which might get attention. Or you could use your leverage. My leverage. You own 15 liens in that neighborhood, including the one on the HOA president's house. That gives you standing as a creditor and a homeowner. You've got 2 different angles to work with. If I were you, I'd consider the nuclear option, which is foreclose on her house. I'd considered it, of course, but hearing David say it out loud made it real. In Colorado, HOA liens can lead to foreclosure, though it's a process that takes time and has specific legal requirements. The lien I owned on Patricia's property was substantial enough to justify it, and she was in serious default. "How long would that take?" I asked. "Depends on several factors, but typically a few months minimum. You'd have to file a notice of intent to foreclose, give her time to cure the debt, then go through the legal process. But here's the thing. The moment you file that notice, it becomes public record. Her position as HOA president while being in default on HOA debt, that's going to raise questions, serious questions. Questions that might lead to an investigation into where the HOA money actually went. Exactly. You wouldn't be reporting her directly. You'd just be exercising your legal rights as a creditor, but the scrutiny that follows might uncover things she'd rather keep buried. We talked for another 20 minutes about the specifics. David couldn't give me official legal advice since this wasn't his case and I wasn't charged with anything, but he pointed me toward resources and explained the general process. By the time I hung up, I had a plan. The next morning, I contacted a real estate attorney named Sarah Chen who specialized in foreclosure law. I explained the situation, leaving out the personal conflict with Patricia and focusing on the business side. I owned a valid lien. The debtor was in default, and I wanted to pursue my legal options. Sarah was thorough and professional. She reviewed my documentation, confirmed that the lien was properly recorded and legally valid, and explained the foreclosure process in Colorado. The first step was sending a notice of election and demand, which would inform Patricia that I was declaring the full amount due and intended to foreclose if she didn't pay. She'd have a statutory period to cure the debt, typically 110 to 125 days depending on various factors. "This is going to get complicated," Sarah warned me. "HOA foreclosures always do, and if the debtor is the HOA president, expect drama, lots of drama." "I'm counting on it," I said. The notice of election and demand was prepared, filed with the county, and hand-delivered to Patricia Morrison's house on a Friday afternoon. I wasn't there for the delivery, but I wish I had been. According to the process server's report, Patricia answered the door, read the first few lines, and started screaming that this was impossible and illegal. She slammed the door in the server's face, but the delivery was legally completed. I expected a phone call. What I got was a certified letter from Richard Kensington, the HOA attorney, delivered Monday morning. The letter was 3 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to several key points. First, Kensington claimed the lien was invalid because of technical errors in how it had been recorded. Second, he argued that my position as a homeowner in the HOA created a conflict of interest that prevented me from foreclosing on another member. Third, he suggested that this was retaliation for Patricia's legitimate enforcement of HOA rules and could be considered harassment. The letter demanded I withdraw the foreclosure action immediately or face a counter-suit for damages. I forwarded the letter to Sarah Chen, who called me 30 minutes later laughing. "This is garbage," she said bluntly. "Every argument he's making is either factually wrong or legally baseless. The lien is perfectly valid. Your status as a homeowner doesn't create any conflict, and exercising your legal rights as a creditor isn't retaliation or harassment. So what do? Nothing. We proceed exactly as planned. Let him file a counter-suit if he wants. It'll get tossed out, and it might even help us by creating more public record of what's going on." The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. It was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed the pool equipment and maintenance supplies. I'd never attended a board meeting before, but I made a point of showing up this time. The room was packed. Word had spread about the foreclosure action, and apparently half the neighborhood wanted to see what would happen. I recognized faces from around the subdivision. Mr. Patterson from next door gave me a small nod. Jennifer Zimmerman, who'd posted on Facebook about Patricia's brother-in-law's snow removal company, was there with her husband. Patricia sat at the front table with 4 other board members. When I walked in, her face went through several colors before settling on a deep red. She leaned over and whispered furiously to the man next to her, whom I recognized as Thomas Brennan, the board treasurer. The meeting started 15 minutes late. Patricia kept looking at the door like she was expecting someone. Finally, Richard Kensington walked in, carrying a briefcase and wearing an expensive suit. He took a seat in the front row, directly behind Patricia. "Let's begin," Patricia said, her voice tight. "First item on the agenda is a discussion of recent legal matters affecting the HOA." "Point of order," called a voice from the back. It was Jennifer Zimmerman. "According to our bylaws, homeowners have the right to add items to the agenda at the start of the meeting. I'd like to add a discussion of the special assessment from December and how those funds were spent." Patricia's expression could have curdled milk. "That's not how it works. You need to submit agenda items in writing at least 1 week before the meeting." Jennifer held up her phone. "I emailed the board 1 week ago. I have the sent receipt right here." "I never received such an email." "That's interesting, because 3 other board members responded acknowledging receipt." This was news to Patricia, clearly. She shot looks at the other board members, 2 of whom suddenly became very interested in the papers in front of them. "Fine," Patricia said. "We'll address that topic under new business. Now, regarding the legal matter at hand. As you may have heard, a member of this community has launched a baseless and retaliatory foreclosure action against me personally. I want to assure everyone that this action is completely without merit and will be resolved quickly. The HOA will be supporting my legal defense as this is clearly an attack on the board's authority." "Point of order," I said, standing up. All eyes turned to me. "The HOA cannot use association funds to defend a board member's personal debt. That would be misappropriation of funds and a breach of fiduciary duty." Patricia's face went even redder. "Mr. Fletcher, you are not recognized to speak." "Actually, under the bylaws, any homeowner can speak during board meetings unless specifically prohibited by a majority vote." "Would you like to call for such a vote?" The room had gone completely silent. Patricia looked at Richard Kensington, who shook his head slightly. "Taking a vote to silence me would look terrible and probably fail anyway given the mood in the room." "You have 2 minutes," Patricia said through clenched teeth. "I own a legally valid lien on Mrs. Morrison's property. That lien exists because she failed to pay the special assessment that this HOA levied in December. I purchased that lien at a public auction, which is a normal business transaction. The foreclosure action is a standard legal process for recovering debt. It has nothing to do with HOA business or board authority. It's a private matter between me as a creditor and Mrs. Morrison as a debtor. You only did this because I enforced HOA rules against you," Patricia shouted, standing up. "Actually, you sent me a fraudulent bill for services that were never performed. Then you withdrew that bill when I demanded documentation. That's not rule enforcement. That's something else entirely." The room erupted. Multiple people started shouting questions. Had Patricia sent fake bills to other people? Were the snow removal charges legitimate? What about the special assessment? Patricia hammered a gavel on the table, calling for order. It took 5 minutes to get everyone quiet again. Thomas Brennan, the treasurer, raised his hand. Patricia looked like she wanted to ignore him, but he was a board member. She had to acknowledge him. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room," Thomas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the now silent space. "Patricia, you're in default on the special assessment. That's a private matter. You're the HOA president. You pushed through that assessment without a proper vote. Now we learn you didn't even pay it yourself. How is that possible?" "My financial situation is none of your business, Thomas." "It is when you're managing $350,000 of our money. I've been asking to see the detailed financial reports for months. You keep saying they're not ready. Why is that?" Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "This meeting is over. We'll reconvene when people can be civil." "You can't just end the meeting," Jennifer said. We have quorum and there are matters on the agenda. I'm the president and I'm ending this meeting." "Actually," Thomas said, pulling out a copy of the bylaws, "the president can't unilaterally end a meeting if a majority of board members vote to continue. I vote to continue." Two other board members raised their hands. "We vote to continue too." Patricia looked at Richard Kensington, who had gone pale. He leaned forward and whispered something to her. She shook her head violently, but he kept whispering. Finally, she grabbed her purse and walked out of the room without another word. The meeting continued without her for another 2 hours. Thomas Brennan took over as acting chair. Jennifer's questions about the special assessment were discussed at length. Thomas admitted he'd been concerned about the financial documentation for months, but Patricia had stonewalled him at every turn. The board voted unanimously to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, with a particular focus on the special assessment expenditures. They also voted to suspend Patricia's authority to sign checks or make financial decisions pending the audit results. And they voted to retain separate legal counsel, as Richard Kensington's continued representation posed a conflict of interest given that he was defending Patricia personally. I stayed quiet through most of this, just watching. The homeowners were furious once they understood what had been going on. Several people shared stories of being bullied by Patricia, threatened with fines or liens for minor violations, or pressured to use specific contractors who turned out to be connected to her family. As the meeting broke up, Jennifer came over to me. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know if you intended to blow this whole thing open, but you did." "I just wanted to collect on a legitimate debt," I said, which was mostly true. "Sure you did." She gave me a knowing smile. "My husband's a CPA. If the board needs help reviewing the financial records, he'll volunteer his time." Over the next month, the audit proceeded. The independent auditor, a forensic accountant named Rita Chen, no relation to my attorney Sarah, was thorough and relentless. She requested bank statements, invoices, contracts, and receipts for every transaction going back 3 years. What she found was worse than I'd suspected. The special assessment had raised $350,000 from homeowners who'd paid. Another $75,000 had been placed in liens when homeowners couldn't pay quickly enough. Of the $350,000 collected, only about $110,000 had gone to legitimate neighborhood improvements. The rest had vanished into payments to shell companies, inflated invoices to family-owned businesses, and outright cash withdrawals that Patricia had classified as administrative expenses. Rita's report, which was shared with all homeowners, documented over $230,000 in apparent fraud. She referred her findings to the district attorney's office, as she was required to do under Colorado law when discovering evidence of criminal activity. My friend David called me the day after the referral hit his office. "You've created quite the situation," he said. "This landed on my supervisor's desk, and she's taking it seriously. We're opening a full investigation. What happens now?" "We'll subpoena records, interview witnesses, probably execute a search warrant on Patricia's home and office. If the evidence supports it, we'll bring charges: theft, embezzlement, fraud, possibly forgery if she signed other people's names to documents. This is serious stuff, Warren. She could be looking at years in prison." "Good," I said, surprised at how much I meant it. The investigation took another 2 months. During that time, my foreclosure action proceeded through the courts. Patricia made no effort to cure the debt or contest the process in any meaningful way. Richard Kensington had stopped representing her after the criminal investigation began, and she apparently couldn't find another attorney willing to take her case. The HOA board, under new leadership after Patricia was removed by an emergency vote, tried to work out a payment plan for Patricia's debt. They offered to forgive the late fees and interest if she'd pay the original $16,000. I was willing to accept that, but Patricia refused to communicate with anyone. She'd essentially barricaded herself in her house, refusing to answer the door or return calls. In late May, the district attorney filed formal charges. Patricia Morrison was charged with 14 counts of theft, 8 counts of forgery, 5 counts of fraud, and 3 counts of official misconduct. The total value of the theft exceeded $230,000, making it a Class 3 felony with significant prison time attached. She was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I was at work when I got the text from Marcus with a link to the news story. Local media had picked up the story because HOA fraud cases were becoming increasingly common, and this one was particularly egregious. The headline read, "Denver HOA President Arrested for Embezzlement Scheme." The article included Patricia's booking photo. She looked older than I remembered, worn down and angry. According to the report, she'd been released on $50,000 bond and was awaiting trial. My foreclosure case concluded in June. Patricia never showed up to the final hearing, and the judge granted my request for a foreclosure decree. The property would be sold at a public auction to satisfy the debt, with any excess proceeds going to Patricia. Given that her house was worth about $400,000 and she owed me $16,000 plus legal fees, she'd walk away with significant equity. But she'd lose the house itself. The sale was scheduled for July 15th. I attended the auction, which was held on the courthouse steps as required by law. It was a surprisingly quick process. The auctioneer read the legal description of the property, stated the opening bid amount, and asked for bidders. I bid the minimum required to cover the debt and fees. No one else bid against me, which wasn't surprising. Properties sold at HOA foreclosure auctions often have complicated title issues, and bidders need to do serious due diligence. The gavel came down, and I was suddenly the owner of 2847 Clearwater Drive. I'd thought about what to do with the property for weeks. I could rent it out, sell it immediately for a profit, or get creative. In the end, I decided on creative. The HOA, now under new management and facing serious financial shortfalls because of Patricia's embezzlement, was struggling. The special assessment money was gone, and the neighborhood improvements that were supposed to have been completed were still undone. The new board had filed a civil suit against Patricia to recover the stolen funds, but her assets were tied up in criminal proceedings and legal fees. Recovery would take years if it happened at all. I approached the HOA board with a proposal. I donate Patricia's former house to the HOA to be sold, with all proceeds going to complete the neighborhood improvements that had been promised. In exchange, the HOA would forgive the liens on the 14 other properties I'd purchased. Those homeowners, who'd been victims of Patricia's scheme just like everyone else, would get a fresh start. The board unanimously accepted. The math worked out well for everyone. Patricia's house sold for $380,000 in a market sale that August. After paying off the remaining mortgage and selling costs, the HOA netted about $290,000. The landscaping was finally installed. The pool got its repairs. The playground equipment was purchased from a legitimate company, and 14 families got their homes clear of threatening liens that had been ruining their credit and causing immense stress. Patricia Morrison's criminal trial was scheduled for October, but she accepted a plea deal in September. She pleaded guilty to 8 counts of theft and 3 counts of fraud in exchange for the other charges being dropped. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, though everyone knew that was largely symbolic. She'd already lost her house, her husband had filed for divorce, and her assets were depleted. The day she was sentenced, I was sitting in my living room reading the news coverage on my laptop. I felt a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction that justice had been served, relief that the neighborhood was moving forward, a little bit of guilt that my actions had set all of this in motion, even though Patricia's crimes were entirely her own fault. My doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mr. Patterson from next door, holding a pie. "My wife made this for you," he said, smiling. "Apple, your favorite if I remember right from the neighborhood barbecue. You didn't have to do that. We wanted to. Warren, you did something important. You stood up to a bully when no one else would. That special assessment was going to force us out of our house. We couldn't afford it. When the Lien got forgiven, it saved us. So thank you." After he left, I sat down with a slice of pie and thought about the whole situation. I hadn't set out to be a hero. I just wanted to collect on a legitimate investment and maybe teach Patricia a lesson about sending fake bills. But sometimes things spiral in unexpected directions. The Riverside Meadows HOA board sent me a formal letter of appreciation that November. They'd commissioned a bench to be placed near the community pool with a plaque that read, "In appreciation of community members who stand up for what's right." My name wasn't on it, at my request, but I knew. Jennifer Zimmerman was elected as the new HOA president in the annual election. Her platform was transparency and accountability, and she won in a landslide. One of her first actions was implementing new financial controls that required multiple board members to approve any expenditure over $5,000, with quarterly financial reports distributed to all homeowners. The neighborhood felt different now. People were more engaged, more willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. The Facebook group, which had been Patricia's personal fiefdom of complaints and petty enforcement, became an actual community forum where neighbors helped each other and shared information. I ran into Richard Kensington, Patricia's former attorney, at a real estate law conference in November. We ended up at the same networking reception, and after an awkward moment of recognition, he came over to talk. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I knew something was wrong with Patricia's bills and assessments, but I didn't push hard enough. I was getting paid and I looked the other way." "That was wrong. Are you still representing HOAs?" "I am, but differently now. I've started specializing in helping boards implement oversight and accountability measures, trying to prevent what happened in Riverside Meadows from happening elsewhere." "That's good. We need more of that." We talked for a while about the legal issues involved, the warning signs he'd missed, and how HOA governance could be improved. It was a surprisingly productive conversation, and I left feeling like maybe some good was coming from all of this beyond just my neighborhood. My work life continued as normal through all of this. My boss at the investment firm knew about the HOA situation in general terms, and he'd found it amusing that my side business had intersected with my personal life in such a dramatic way. He'd asked if I'd be interested in developing a specialized practice area buying distressed HOA debt, but I declined. Once was enough. I did, however, write an article about the experience for a real estate investment journal. I changed the names and some identifying details, but the core story was there. The article focused on the due diligence necessary when purchasing HOA liens, the legal complexities of foreclosure, and the importance of understanding the properties behind the numbers. It got published in March, and I received several speaking invitations to discuss HOA investment strategies at industry conferences. Through all of this, I stayed in my house on Clearwater Drive. Some people asked if I'd consider moving after everything that happened, but I liked my house. I liked my neighborhood, especially now that it was recovering from Patricia's reign. The community felt stronger, more connected. People looked out for each other now. On a Saturday morning in April, almost exactly a year after I'd received that fake snow removal bill, I was out front planting flowers in my garden beds. Marcus came jogging by on his morning run and stopped to chat. "Man, can you believe it's been a year?" he said, breathing hard from his exercise. "I was just thinking about that. You ever regret how it all went down?" I thought about the question. Patricia was in prison. Her family had fallen apart. 14 families had been saved from losing their homes. A neighborhood had been freed from a corrupt leader. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in embezzled funds had been exposed and partially recovered. "No," I said. "I don't regret it. She made her choices. I just enforced my rights as a creditor." Everything that followed was a consequence of her own actions. Still, it's pretty wild that it all started with a fake snow removal bill. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. Marcus jogged off, and I went back to my planting. The spring sun was warm, and the neighborhood was quiet in that peaceful Saturday morning way. Kids were riding bikes down the street. Someone was mowing their lawn a few houses over. The smell of someone grilling an early lunch drifted through the air. A car pulled up and Jennifer Zimmerman got out with her husband. They walked over with a folder. "Warren, do you have a minute?" Jennifer asked. "Sure, what's up?" "The board wanted to update you on something. We finalized the civil suit settlement against Patricia's remaining assets. We recovered another $43,000. Combined with some insurance recovery for the forgery and fraud, we're actually in pretty good shape financially." "That's great news." "It is, and we wanted to ask you something. We're creating a community oversight committee to review HOA finances and major decisions. Independent homeowners with relevant expertise who can provide checks and balances on the board. Would you be willing to serve?" I'd spent a year trying to stay out of HOA politics, beyond the specific situation with Patricia. But looking at Jennifer's earnest face, thinking about Mr. Patterson and the 14 families who'd been saved from foreclosure, I realized I had an opportunity to help prevent future problems. "I'll do it," I said, "on one condition: we document everything. Every meeting, every decision, every financial review, complete transparency." "That's exactly what we want." They stayed for coffee and we discussed the structure and responsibilities of the oversight committee. It would meet quarterly, review financial statements in detail, audit a random sample of vendor contracts and invoices, and report findings directly to the full HOA membership. Jennifer had already recruited an attorney, an accountant, and a retired project manager to serve alongside me. After they left, I sat on my porch with my coffee and thought about how strange life can be. A year ago, I was just a guy who wanted to be left alone to live in his house peacefully. A fake bill had pushed me to dig deeper. My professional skills had intersected with personal circumstances. And I'd ended up owning the debt of the person trying to scam me, which had ultimately exposed a massive fraud scheme. The irony still made me shake my head. But beyond the irony, there was something more meaningful. A community had been damaged by corruption and was now healing. People who'd been victims had found justice. Systems that had been broken were being repaired with better oversight and accountability. And it had all started because I decided not to just pay a fake bill and move on. Sometimes standing up for what's right leads to unexpected places. Sometimes doing your homework and knowing your rights makes all the difference. And sometimes the person trying to bully you turns out to be standing on very shaky ground themselves. Patricia Morrison had thought she could abuse her authority indefinitely. She'd gotten away with it for years, probably becoming more brazen as time went on. But she'd made a critical error when she targeted me with that snow removal bill. Not because I was special or particularly heroic, but because I was someone who knew how to follow a paper trail, who had the skills to uncover financial irregularities, and who happened to own her debt through sheer coincidence. The combination of those factors had been her undoing. In the months that followed, I settled into my role on the oversight committee. The work was detailed and sometimes tedious, but it was important. We caught several instances of vendors overcharging, discovered that the pool maintenance contract was unnecessarily expensive, and identified opportunities to save the HOA money through better practices. Jennifer's leadership as president was transformative. She held regular town halls where homeowners could ask questions and raise concerns. She implemented online voting for major decisions. She negotiated better contracts with service providers. The neighborhood thrived under her management in ways it never had under Patricia. I continued my work as a financial analyst downtown, but my experience with the HOA situation had opened new doors. I was invited to consult on several cases involving distressed community associations. I helped a condo complex in Aurora uncover accounting irregularities. I advised a townhome association in Littleton on restructuring their debt. I even testified as an expert witness in a case involving HOA fraud in Colorado Springs. The work was satisfying in ways my regular job wasn't. I was using my skills to help ordinary people protect themselves from abuse and corruption. I was making a real difference in communities that needed someone willing to dig through complex financial records and find the truth. My friendship with David, the prosecutor, deepened as we occasionally collaborated on cases where HOA issues crossed over into criminal territory. He told me that Patricia's case had become something of a training example in the district attorney's office for how to prosecute white-collar crime in community associations. The thorough documentation and clear paper trail had made it a strong case that resulted in actual prison time, which was rare in HOA fraud matters. By the time winter rolled around again, a full cycle of seasons since the fake snow removal bill, the neighborhood was unrecognizable in the best way. The entrance landscaping was beautiful. The pool had been repaired and upgraded. The playground had new equipment that kids actually wanted to use. And most importantly, homeowners felt safe and respected rather than threatened and bullied. When the first major snowstorm of the season hit in late November, I was out early with my snowblower as always. This time, though, several neighbors were out too. We helped each other clear driveways and sidewalks. Someone brought out thermoses of hot chocolate. Kids had snowball fights in the street. It felt like a real community, something it hadn't felt like before. Nobody received fake bills for snow removal that had never happened. Nobody was threatened with liens for minor violations. Nobody had to worry that the person managing the HOA finances was stealing their money. It seemed simple, but it was a profound change from where we'd been just a year earlier. I thought about Patricia sometimes, serving her prison sentence downstate. I didn't take pleasure in her incarceration, but I didn't feel guilty about it either. She'd made choices, lots of them, over several years. She'd stolen from families, threatened people's homes, abused her authority, and shown no remorse until she'd been caught. The consequences were the natural result of her actions. What I did feel was satisfaction that the system had ultimately worked. It had taken time and effort. It had required someone willing to stand up and push back. But justice had been served, corruption had been exposed, and a community had been protected. And it had all started because I'd opened my mailbox one Tuesday morning, found a fake bill for snow removal I'd done myself, and decided to do something about it rather than just pay up and move on. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance against unfairness can ripple outward in unexpected ways. As I stood in my cleared driveway that snowy November morning, watching neighbors help each other and kids play in the snow, I realized that this was what community was supposed to be. People looking out for one another, systems working fairly and transparently, leaders serving rather than exploiting. It wasn't complicated, but it was valuable. The story of Patricia Morrison and the Riverside Meadows HOA became something I occasionally told at dinner parties or networking events, usually edited for length and drama. People always found it remarkable that I'd ended up owning the debt of the person trying to scam me. They called it karma or poetic justice or just really fortunate coincidence. I thought of it differently. I thought of it as what happens when someone who understands systems and documentation comes up against someone who's been cutting corners and assuming they'll never face consequences. Patricia had gotten sloppy, probably because she'd been getting away with it for so long. She'd stopped being careful about covering her tracks, and when someone with the skills and motivation to investigate came along, her house of cards collapsed quickly. The lesson, if there was one, was about the importance of accountability. Systems work when people are held accountable for their actions. HOA, governments, businesses, any organization, they all function better when there are checks and balances, when records are kept and reviewed, when people aren't afraid to ask questions and demand answers. Patricia Morrison had operated for years in an environment with no real accountability. Homeowners had been too busy or too intimidated to question her. Board members had been hand-picked yes people who rubber-stamped her decisions. The attorney she'd hired had been willing to go along with questionable practices as long as he got paid. And the result had been corruption that hurt dozens of families and stole hundreds of thousands of dollars. But once accountability was introduced, everything changed. An audit revealed the truth. A criminal investigation held her responsible. A foreclosure action enforced the financial consequences of her choices. And a community came together to demand better governance going forward. I went back inside to warm up after finishing my snow removal, making myself a cup of coffee, and settling in at my kitchen table with my laptop. The same table where I'd sat a year ago, discovering that I owned Patricia's Lien and starting down a path I'd never anticipated. Life had a funny way of coming full circle sometimes. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. The HOA board was planning a one-year anniversary celebration of the new governance structure. They wanted to do a neighborhood barbecue in the spring, once the weather warmed up. She asked if I'd be willing to say a few words about the importance of transparency and accountability. I agreed, though public speaking wasn't my favorite activity. But this felt important, not to celebrate Patricia's downfall or my role in exposing her, but to mark the community's recovery and commitment to doing better. That was worth stepping outside my comfort zone. As winter progressed into the new year, I continued my regular routines. Work downtown during the week, oversight committee meetings quarterly, occasional consulting work on HOA issues, time with friends and family. Normal life, in other words, though perhaps with a bit more purpose than before. The fake snow removal bill still hung in my home office, framed now as a reminder. Not a trophy of victory, but a symbol of what can happen when you pay attention and refuse to be pushed around. $375 for services never rendered, signed by Patricia Morrison with the HOA's gold embossed letterhead. Such a small thing, really, but it had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire tapestry of corruption. I'd learned something through the whole experience about the importance of standing up for yourself, even in small matters. That fake bill could have just been $375 I paid to avoid hassle. Many people would have made that choice. But I decided to ask questions, to demand documentation, to exercise my rights. And that decision had cascaded into much larger consequences than I'd ever imagined. Sometimes I wondered how many other HOAs had their own Patricia Morrisons. How many community associations were dealing with corruption, embezzlement, or abuse of authority. The statistics suggested it was more common than most people realized. Billions of dollars flowed through HOAs every year, and the oversight was often minimal. It was fertile ground for bad actors. But I also knew that most HOA board members were honest people trying to serve their communities. They volunteered their time, dealt with complaints and problems, and worked to keep neighborhoods running smoothly. Patricia was an exception, not the rule. The challenge was creating systems that supported the good actors while preventing and catching the bad ones. That was what the Oversight Committee was for. That was why transparency and documentation mattered. That was why homeowners needed to pay attention and ask questions. Not because everyone was corrupt, but because systems without accountability inevitably attract corruption eventually. The spring barbecue happened in May, on a beautiful Saturday with clear blue skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. The whole neighborhood turned out. There was food, music, games for kids, and a genuine sense of celebration. This was what community felt like when it was healthy. Jennifer gave a speech about the journey the neighborhood had been on, from the dark days of Patricia's corruption through the investigation and trial to the recovery and new governance structure. She thanked the various people who'd helped along the way, the auditor, the new attorney, the board members who'd stood up when it mattered. Then she introduced me. I walked up to the makeshift podium feeling nervous but determined. I'd prepared some remarks, but as I looked out at the familiar faces of my neighbors, I decided to speak from the heart instead. A little over a year ago, I got a bill in the mail for snow removal I'd done myself, I started. It was a small thing, just a few $100s, and I could have paid it and moved on. But something about it bothered me, not just that it was wrong, but that someone thought they could get away with it, so I asked questions. I demanded documentation. I exercised my rights as a homeowner. And what I found was much bigger than a fake bill. I talked about the importance of accountability, about how systems only work when people pay attention and speak up. I talked about the value of community and looking out for one another. I talked about the changes in our neighborhood and how proud I was to be part of it. We're not perfect, I concluded. We'll make mistakes going forward, but we're committed to transparency, to fairness, to treating each other with respect. And that's what community is supposed to be. Thank you for giving me the honor of being part of this neighborhood. The applause was warm and genuine. People came up afterward to shake my hand and share their own stories. The couple who'd almost lost their house to foreclosure before the Liens were forgiven. The single mom who Patricia had threatened with fines she couldn't afford. The elderly couple who'd been scared to speak up because they didn't want to rock the boat. All of them had stories about how the changes in the HOA had improved their lives. It was humbling and gratifying in equal measure. As the barbecue wound down and the sun started to set, I found myself sitting on a bench near the pool, watching kids play on the new playground equipment. Mr. Patterson came and sat next to me. You know, My wife and I have been in this neighborhood for 23 years, he said. We've seen a lot of board members come and go. Patricia was the worst by far. But this past year, under Jennifer's leadership, it's been the best I can remember. You had a lot to do with that. I just enforced a lien I happen to own. You did more than that, and you know it. You stood up when others wouldn't. You used your skills to uncover the truth. You could have just moved to a different neighborhood and avoided all the drama, but you stayed and helped fix things. That matters. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood life unfold around us. It was a perfect moment, one of those times when you feel completely content with where you are and what you've done. Patricia Morrison tried billing me for snow removal and discovered I was the one who bought her lien. That coincidence had set everything in motion. But the real story wasn't about coincidence or even justice. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide not to accept corruption and abuse. It was about communities healing and becoming stronger. It was about the power of accountability and transparency. I went home that evening feeling grateful. Grateful for my house, for my neighborhood, for the friends I'd made through this experience. Grateful that I'd opened that mail one Tuesday morning and decided to ask questions rather than just accept a fake bill. Grateful that I'd had the skills and opportunity to make a difference. The framed snow removal bill in my office wasn't just a reminder of where things started. It was a reminder that small acts of resistance matter. That standing up for what's right can have ripple effects beyond what you can imagine. That documentation and accountability are powerful tools against corruption. That communities are strongest when people look out for one another and demand fair treatment. Patricia Morrison was serving time for her crimes. The neighborhood she'd exploited and stolen from was thriving under new leadership. The systems she'd abused had been reformed with better oversight. And the homeowners she'd threatened and intimidated had found their voices and their power. All because of a fake bill for $375 and someone who decided not to pay it.